Good morning, everyone. Let's begin with a prayer. Dear God in heaven, we are grateful for an understanding of the law of equality. We are grateful for an understanding of the law of equality, as it has not only freed us, it has also freed you. You are able to interact with us in ways you were not able to before. And for this, I'm grateful. May this presentation be a reflection of that fact. Pray in Jesus' name. Amen. So yesterday, in my last presentation, we discussed the Old and New Covenants for humanity. It was just an introduction because there's a lot to say about these lines, but our time is limited. So I'm trying to simplify and summarize. We've already discussed how ancient Israel explains all the other histories. So I won't repeat that. Israel had an old covenant and a new covenant. The new covenant took time to introduce. It began after the 70-year captivity. Which happened because Israel had asked for kings. And when they asked for kings, they forgot about the law. Sometimes when they had a good king, they would try and pay attention to the law. So that the knowledge of the law would not be lost, and so that people didn't continue to suffer, the system of the kings was broken up. When Israel went into captivity, it was not really punishment, even though it is framed as punishment in the Bible. Remember, the Bible is written in a very patriarchal way. And Israel had a very patriarchal understanding of God. But what God was trying to do was break up the unrighteous systems, unrighteous institutions that were not taking care of the people of Israel. But under the circumstances of that time, it was not possible to break up the system of kings without taking the Israelites into captivity. So God decided they would go into captivity to protect them and to protect the knowledge of the law. After the captivity, the new covenant begins. You no longer have this system of kings controlling uh, the religion of Israel. Israel could now pay attention to the law. The work now focused heavily on scribes and teachers. The law was now in the forefront of their mind. So I was saying after the captivity, they started focusing on the law. And they started organizing around religious identity. Without the distraction of political kingship. This made the Jewish religion portable. You could be a Jew outside of Jerusalem. You have the rise and development of synagogues in different parts of the ancient world. You end up having the rise of the Pharisees that focused a lot on the law. You also have the rise of the Sadducees later on that tried to liberalize Judaism. They actually developed this concept of having Jewish proselytes. People that were not born Jewish, but would accept the religion of the Jews. So there was progress, there was development. The understanding of equality was getting better, even though there was a lot of work to still do. The new covenant had already begun. An important point to note is that these new covenant ideas, the law of equality, like I said, was hidden in this Jewish system. So the Jewish system became a vessel to allow for the development of the law of equality. You could picture it as a pregnant woman. And the baby inside the womb is dependent on the mother until they grow enough to be born and start having an independent life. That baby is not Jesus. Who's that baby? The church is the woman that's taking care of the baby, allowing the baby to grow. That baby can't live in the womb forever. The baby will have to be born and, and start a life on its own. Who's that baby? I said it already. It's the law. The law was protected, incubated in the Jewish system. Then, in the fullness of time, it would be set up and have a life of its own, separate from the Jewish system. We see that fulfilled in the development of Christianity. So the story at the end isn't just about Jesus, the person, it's about the system that Jesus created. Christianity, which could more perfectly represent the idea of equality under the law. I hope that makes sense. So we come to humanity, try to give examples of why Eden was the old covenant. And I try to explain we use these words because that's what the Bible gives us. I said probably a better word would be limited covenant. And what's limited is the understanding of the law and how far the law can be applied. The law can be applied. So, a limited understanding of the law means a limited application of the law. But as humans get better in their understanding of the law, then you start seeing a better application of the law. Spoke of mediators. Moses being the mediator for ancient Israel, and Jesus the mediator of humanity as a whole. So when we spoke about ancient Israel, what we were focused on is the Jewish system. So the laws and the system of social organization. Similarly, when we talk about humanity, we're talking about law and systems of social organization. Institutions. So a simple way to put it is kingdoms. But it's more than just kingdoms, because there's multiple institutions that manage human life. As we shall see. So we discussed how when you get to the flood, because of the world that then existed, with a limited understanding of the law, and no proper institutions to protect individuals, God was forced to destroy the entire world. What God was trying to destroy is an unrighteous system. But because at that time, life was very personal, these systems were so tightly connected with the people. So, in order to destroy the unrighteous patriarchal systems that caused suffering and threatened the knowledge of the law, you had to get rid of the people as well. And thus the flood happened. And only Noah and his family were saved. After the flood, humanity begins to organize around kings. Generally, we identify Nimrod as the first king. And we talked about God confusing the languages there, which was going to come with its own set of problems. But it was better than having a universal dictator. So, what God was doing was decentralizing power, limiting the power of any potential dictator to a few territories and not the whole world. But what was going to be a side effect of that is people wouldn't identify as one, people would not identify as the same. They would see themselves as different. So they would stick to those that looked like them and spoke the same language as them. They would develop their cultures independently, and these nations would war against each other. So we'd have nation against nation. You'd have slavery as nations tried to survive and protect themselves. And would have genocide, also as an attempt to protect yourself. But what you would not have, which was progress, is a global dictatorship. So, as painful as those atrocities have been, they were actually limited by the confusion of the languages. God was doing the best they could under the circumstances. So humanity now goes under ancient kingdoms. Humanity is managed by ancient kingdoms. The ones that we are familiar with, but they're definitely not the only ones, are the kingdoms of Bible prophecy. And if you have noticed, I hope you have noticed, in our studies of Revelation 17, we have moved away from the idea of these kingdoms being the kingdoms of Satan. And we recognize that these kingdoms were good. They were raised up for good. They were the institutions that Jesus was using to develop the law. They were the incubator for the human race to learn law. So this is why Daniel says that God removes kings and sets up kings. This was all part of the ministration of Christ as our mediator, as our schoolmaster. If you go back into history, somewhere in this history, there's a law code that's known as the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi. So it's just one example, but I think it's a good example of how human beings were getting better in their understanding of law. The Code of Hammurabi was remarkably just for its time. It actually had laws for property rights, marriage rights, women's rights. As limited as they were, but the work had already begun of codifying the laws of equality. It would only get better with time. And it's in the Code of Hammurabi that we get a famous statement that's also found in the Bible. Does anyone know what that statement is? It's close to that. What Shimen said is, do unto others as you want them to do unto you. So it's related to that, but I want the actual statement, the famous statement. So Natalie has said it. It's eye for an eye. Who used this statement? Moses. So this wasn't Moses' construction. It was a common understanding in the ancient world. It was found in the Code of Hammurabi. Scholars actually notice similarities between the law of Moses and the Code of Hammurabi. And in history, I think Hammurabi lived before Moses. Anyway, moving on. We've got Ancient kingdoms managing human life. Babylon is given the responsibility of taking care of humanity. We see that in Daniel chapter 4 with the tree that was meant to take care of everyone. Hopefully, now it won't be a strange idea that God would say, Nebuchadnezzar is my servant, and he does my will. Or that Cyrus is mine anointed. Because God, Jesus, was actually working through these earthly kingdoms to develop an understanding of equality that would encompass all of humanity. The problem with these ancient kingdoms is that the king centralized religious and political power. So you get to 508, where the daily is taken away. What's actually happening here is the separation of church and state. I know we normally think of it as the combination of church and state, but perhaps we don't appreciate how religion and politics interacted in the ancient world. Religion was a part of the state. It was a tool of the state. I'll use Rome as an example. If you held public office in the Roman Empire, part of your official duties as a civil servant could be collecting taxes, passing laws, but you also had to offer sacrifices to the gods. It was the same office. There was no difference. When Christianity comes around, it turns the Roman world upside down. And religious authority is stripped from the king. Jesus hinted at the fact that that's what was going on. Jesus suggested that that's what was going on. When he said, give to Caesar what belongs to Caesar, then he said, give to God what belongs to God. That was a revolutionary statement. Because what he was saying is the ancient world recognizes Caesar as the ultimate religious authority, the earthly representative of God, but he isn't. He's the political representative. Religious authority does not belong to him. This idea was going to continue to develop. In fact, this is the idea that got the early Christians persecuted. The fact that they would not acknowledge the religious authority of Caesar. And they insisted that religious authority is separate from the empire. And then they were seen as a threat. That's why they were persecuted. But the work they did changed the world. Because by the time you get to 508, a new political order was rising. One in which kings would not have religious authority institutionally. You'd have a separate institution that has religious authority and performs a religious function. We call that institution the church. If we think of Daniel 2, it's the clay in the feet of iron and clay. Two separate entities. Sometimes they would work together, which is what we're familiar with. But sometimes they would fight each other. And that fighting was positive. It was important for kings to have checks on their power. Even though that was done by the papacy, it was a good thing. So there's another perspective to the story of Daniel 8. Positive one. In the development of human institutions. And I said the new covenant was beginning officially. Even though you could see some ideas before 548. But this new world that Clovis ushered in the medieval world was going to allow for a more rapid development of the ideas of equality. Because truth seeking was now separated from the state. Just like after the 70-year captivity, truth seeking was separated from that system of the kings. They were not distracted by national politics. So I mentioned some developments in art and science, in political philosophy as well. Mentioned the Renaissance, the Reformation. We've got Enlightenment ideas. You can talk about the scientific revolution. And this is why I was saying it's too simple to just say kingdoms are the institutions. Because there's multiple institutions that manage human life. So we have institutions of learning. talk about academia. We've got the church. We've got other institutions as well. All these contribute to the understanding that humanity develops. Development of technology, the development of political ideology. I explained that you get um, liberal ideas from this time period. So when we get to 1798 and we see the rise of the USA, the responsibility of taking care of humanity and of taking care of the law shifts, changes from the kings of Europe, because most of this development happened in Europe. All this stuff that I'm pointing to now. We shift now to the USA. So the USA becomes the representative of Jesus in developing this child, this baby, which is the law. So we've got the rise of modern democratic states, the rise of liberal politics. And when I use this word liberal, I mean it in a classical sense. So it's called classical liberalism. It's not about left wing ideas and policies. What it's about is just political rights and freedoms. And this is what is meant when they talk about the liberal international order. They mean liberal in the classical sense. So both right wing parties and left wing parties believe in the same ideas. I hope that makes sense. So this history develops, spoke about how this is still a patriarchal framework or understanding. Still have a system of national cultures, nationalism, and continual warfare forces them to start developing a new system, a more liberal system, one that would hopefully stop nations warring against each other. So thus we have the birth of the liberal international order, which really began to take over world politics after the fall of the Soviet Union. So at this time, after 1989, the world becomes truly global. And who is leading out in that work? Who's actually pushing the spread of this liberal international order? The USA. So we know the USA is the leader. So someone asked me yesterday that am I changing the understanding of the USA as a unilateral power from bad to good? And my response, something wrong? So USA unilateral. And we've been taught in the past that this is bad. So the question was, am I changing that and saying unilateral is good? So I can only share my understanding, which I could be wrong, but I'm not changing that understanding. But what I am doing is saying there's more to the story than what we knew before. We were taught the bad perspective, and it's a valid perspective. All you also have to see is the good perspective. And I'm not the first one to do this. It has happened already before me. The latest example is our change from kingdoms of Satan to the kingdoms of this world. And the recognition that all these kingdoms are good. But most of them then become bad. So I hope that answers that question. So I spoke about Jesus as the mediator, but as Curtis explained to us yesterday, we can't see Jesus. Because where's Jesus? Where's Jesus? Jesus is in heaven. But what can we see? We can see the kingdoms of this world and the laws that the kingdoms of this world institute. And the USA instituted this liberal system, opened up its borders and its wealth to the world. America was not being nice. It was their responsibility. That's what they were supposed to do. It wasn't going to be perfect. That's the story of our reform line. There's a lot of ugliness to it, but it was necessary. Because a lot of this internationalism, if we look at the standard of equality today, it wasn't done properly. It was done, I'll just say, by force. If you think of the second Iraq war, not the first one, because the first one, America followed the rules and they kept their objectives very limited. They just wanted to stop Saddam Hussein from bullying another nation. But they did not try to topple him. They did not try to overthrow his government. In 2003, on the other hand, they toppled him. And it created a lot of problems. But it's not just the wars that they did wrong. It's the way they tried to globalize the economy. It left poor nations even poorer, and nations that were already rich just became richer. A lot of local people, especially in the rich countries, lost their jobs. Because those jobs were shipped to cheaper locations. And they didn't have any compensation. I think anyone would be angry if that happened to them. So that started creating a lot of resentment to the international system. People were saying this thing is not good for us because it's hurting us. And they were correct. Because the liberal international order, the ideas are new covenant ideas. But what's the framework in which they're being implemented? What kind of framework? Patriarchal system. It's an old covenant framework. This system built for survival. It's a system built for national interests or national protection. If I'm to use a parable that Jesus taught, this framework was old wineskins. And these ideas were new wine. And what does Jesus say about putting new wine in old wineskins? It doesn't work. You break the wineskins. You break the system. And that's what has happened. America and its allies have tried to push a good agenda, but they've done it in an old system. And by doing that, they have broken the system. And when you break the system, People suffer, sometimes even more than they suffered before. So there's been progress, but what we're also seeing is the limits of the systems that exist. Like what we said about the Jewish nation, it was a necessary system, it was a good incubator, but it was not designed to last forever because it was based on national interests. And what is the Old Covenant? I think the very first property I taught about the Old Covenant. Anyone? The Old Covenant is temporary. It's not designed to last forever. Hopefully, we understand better why now. Because it's a system that is not built for universal rights. It's a system to protect the nation. One nation, not all nations. So that system has to come to an end. It has a probationary time, close of probation. So humanity, I'll say since Eden, particularly after sin, has been under the dispensation of the patriarchal system. It's what has taken care of us, what has educated us, helped us to grow up. It has been our schoolmaster. This is the system that Jesus has had to use. But I want to make a point that even if Adam and Eve had not sinned, humanity would still have had to develop an international system. It just wouldn't have been patriarchal. Wouldn't have had to go through the pain we've now had to go through. But we were still going to have to learn the law and create a complex international system that protects universal rights. We're not always going to live in a garden, in a simple life. We're not designed for that. We're designed to create, not just to be fruitful and multiply. So even though our understanding of law has had to happen in patriarchy, it still would have had to happen even without patriarchy. So, anyway, we come to the end of the world and we recognize that the time for this patriarchal system is coming to an end. So, someone's raised up 1989 to make us aware of that we've reached the time of the end. The end of what? The end of the patriarchal system. So this movement is born because there's a recognition that the covenant that humanity has been under is no longer fit for purpose. Humanity needs a new covenant. So another person asked me yesterday, so is the line of the 144,000 the same as the line of humanity? And my answer was, it's the end of the line of humanity. If you go back to ancient Israel, the old covenant was managed by the Jewish system until this point here, the birth of Jesus, 4 BC. And from that point onwards, the Christian system began to develop because it was meant to take over officially from the Jewish system in 34 AD. This was the priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. In the story of humanity, we've had these ancient kingdoms. We've had the 10 kings of Europe. Then we've had the USA. And all this was bringing us to the point of the development of the 144,000. This system of equality that represents and covers all of humanity. The framework that we have as a movement is capable of doing what no other framework in the world is capable of doing. So these different institutions have certain levels of truth. And they understand things very well in their fields of expertise. What this movement is able to do, our principles, our message, is able to bring all these different truths into a coherent framework. So we can take something from the scientific community, it will fit in our message. Take something from political philosophy, it will have a place in our message. Talk about religious history, political history, all these different things that relate to humanity, the nature of human beings, human psychology. We're able to bring all these things together into the same framework in a way that no other institution can. And thus, this movement becomes the perfect representative of humanity. And the institution that has been raised up to be the custodian of the law of equal rights for the human race. The priesthood after the order of Melchizedek. So Curtis reminded us of the line of Christ as a priest. I'm going to draw it again here. We've got this 30-year preparation period. And in 2019, we begin to speak in the language of equality. And we're going to continue this work for 7 years, reinforcing and strengthening our understanding of equality, of equal rights as a concept. And this brings us to 2026. So someone asked a question about the midst of the week, the cross. And my understanding of that is Jesus is the mediator for humanity, as I explained. And part of the job of a mediator is to reconcile estranged parties. And when Jesus came to this earth, we know that Jesus died on the cross. Who was Jesus dying for? For the Jews or for all of humanity? All of humanity. So Jesus was fulfilling that reconciliation work. And Paul says Jesus died once for all. Therefore, when you come to our history, it doesn't need to happen again. So we don't have that midst of the week. We have the 7-year period of strengthening this new covenant, which brings us to 2026. And so when we, going back to the line of humanity, this priesthood here, after the order of Melchizedek, the one that's not based on bloodline, who we've been raised up to do a work for, it's not ourselves, it's not Adventism, it's humanity. This is what this priesthood has been raised up for. And that this line explains patriarchy manages humanity. Patriarchy manages humanity until the fullness of time. Then, in the fullness of time, an institution's raised up to usher in the new covenant that covers everyone. For ancient Israel, it was Christianity. And then at the end of the world, for humanity, it's the 144,000. And it has been taught in the past that the priesthood and the 144,000 are the same thing. So when we were learning equality in 2019, what we might not have realized is this was the beginning of a work that was going to encompass all of humanity. And so it brings us to 2026. So we come to 1989. Talked about the liberal international order. Spoken about how it was not perfect. because it's new wine in old wineskins. And the problems that it has makes people angry. If you remember what I taught, I think in my first study, about the problem of the old covenant, is that ancient Israel ends up thinking that the blessings belong to us, not anyone else. But they had been raised up to do a work for everyone else. And they found it hard when the time had come. And so that system was done away. It still would have been done away even if they had accepted Christ. But it would have been a smoother transition. So Israel thinks blessings for us only. Adventism thinks the same way. Blessings for us only. We see the same with humanity. All the nations think this way, but I'm going to point out the main nation, the nation that was given the responsibility, the USA. They also believe in this. They have the same problem because it's the side effect of the old covenant. They insist that ideas of equality and freedom were created by us, and they belong to us. They say we created the modern world. These Islamic countries don't understand democracy or political freedom. So we shouldn't be having to spread those ideas to them. And our riches, our money, also belongs to us. Shouldn't be going to them. All this free trade talk. They say it doesn't make sense. So, what's the statement that they use to say blessings for us only? America first. What that just simply represents is the old covenant. And it's an indication that the old covenant's coming to an end. That's exactly what ancient Israel did. When it was time for them to integrate with the Gentiles. So I mentioned the RNC, and I would encourage you to go and look at the party platform. Tucked into that party platform is this idea that liberalism does not make sense. So they reject the liberal international order. And liberal ideas. The Republican Party now since July of 2024, officially became a post-liberal party. What that means is they basically don't believe in this idea that political rights and freedoms belong to everyone else. And they say the interests of the nation are more important than people's individual rights. This is what's motivating America's immigration policy right now. Economic policy with tariffs and so many other things. So in 2024, they were announcing their intention. This is who we are now, and this is what's coming. It was a warning of what was coming. We're going to get rid of this international system. And in this new dispensation, you're going to get warning after warning. And what warns us, by the way? Events. So you're going to get event after event that was warning us that the time for the liberal international order was coming to an end. So whether it was the tariffs in 2025 or the shutting down of US aid or the first Iran war in 2025, in June, I think, and many other events. They were all indicating what the intent of the USA was. And one event which some of us might know and some of us might not be aware of, but that was very important to this developing story, was the publication of America's new national security strategy. On the 4th of December, 2025. This is where the USA officially said, we are not going to promote the liberal international order anymore. It's now official government policy. So in 2024, at the beginning of the dispensation, it was political rhetoric, just a warning. In December, it became official government policy. And at that time, a lot of politicians thought America was joking. When did they realize that this was serious? That the warning was actually being fulfilled. January the 3rd, 2026. They start acting on that intent in a way that's irreversible. So America has violated international law many times. We see it with Panama, as Curtis mentioned. We see it with Iraq in 2003. And we can give other examples as well. But all these different examples, before January the 3rd, America still spoke the language of liberal internationalism. They even tried to justify it using the liberal international system. Think of Bush II, he actually said we're promoting freedom in Iraq. January 3 was not like that. Trump was clear. Venezuela took our oil, we're taking it back. This is not about human rights. It's not about liberal internationalism. So I'll give a few examples as I close of quotes that confirm this fact. So the translators have these quotations. So I'll read the first one by Stephen Miller. This was published by AP News. So he says, you can talk all you want about international niceties and everything else, but we live in a world, in the real world, that is governed by strength, that is governed by force, that is governed by power. These are the iron laws of the world. So this was in response to America's actions in Venezuela. I'll read another one from The Guardian. So Donald Trump was asked about how he views himself and international law. This was on the 8th of January, after the Venezuela operation. So Donald Trump has said, I don't need international law. And he said that his power is limited only by his own morality. No, no restraints. The last one. This is from weforum.org. This is an excerpt from the Canadian Prime Minister's speech. Okay. Is that okay? That's the best I can do. Okay. So Mark Carney said in January of this year, today I will talk about a rupture in the world order. The end of a pleasant fiction. and the beginning of a harsh reality where geopolitics, where the large main power, geopolitics is submitted to no limits, no constraints. So, as I mentioned about equality in the context of Adventism, that events are what guide us, not an internal understanding that's different from everyone else. We are affected by the same things. We should see the same things. And to a great extent, speak of them in similar ways. So it's not just us who recognize that January 3 was the beginning of a new dispensation. Miller recognizes it. Donald Trump recognizes it. Mark Carney recognizes it. Since January, we've been living through the close of probation. We're living through the time of trouble. And there's many themes in this dispensation, in this history. One of them, which I will leave you with, because it's related to the subject at hand. The old covenant for humanity comes to an end here. Jesus is no longer our mediator. We don't need a mediator. Just like ancient Israel didn't need one in 34 AD. Remember, we said Jesus worked through the USA? And with this event, the United States officially gave up its responsibility as this mediating entity, a schoolmaster teaching the law. In the language of the parable of the vineyard, the tenancy has been taken away and given to others. And the others, based on prophecy, is this movement. And the theme that I'm saying is related to this subject is that we have no earthly support. No earthly institution or system can show us how equality is supposed to be done or managed. Not anymore. Not the Republicans, not the Democrats. We're on our own. And that's difficult. So as we continue this dispensation, we'll learn things that may be difficult to process. Difficult to understand. Different from what we've ever known. And the reason why it's different is because this new covenant is not in an old covenant framework. It's totally complete and separate. That applies to our understanding of the law. So, no earthly support for our understanding of the law, no earthly support for our understanding of God, and no earthly support for our understanding of how salvation works. And I'll just mention that there are many other models, some which have been shared this weekend, and many which have not been shared during this weekend, that will shed light on this dispensation. And I'm sure we will continue to learn. Let's pray. Dear God in heaven, we're grateful for the privilege of being able to be in this movement. At the time that the new covenant is being fully implemented. As painful as the shift may be, my prayer is that we might actually see the beauty and glory of this covenant. That it is much better than anything we've ever had. That this is actually what will resolve the sin problem and can help us to be safe for eternity, to be righteous, to have equal rights under the law. In Jesus' name, amen.